The cavern shook, not from the rumbling of ancient machinery, not from the shifting of tectonic plates deep beneath the mountain's roots, but from something far more dangerous, something that made every scaled spine in the imperial hatchery stiffen with primal terror. The eggs were hatching, all 17 of them, at the same time. This had never happened before in the recorded history of the Dracorian Empire. Not during the First Ascension, when the founding emperors had cracked through their shells and consumed the weak. Not during the War of Burning Skis, when the last of the Elder Worms had laid their final clutches before fatting into legend. Not during any of the 14 recorded succession hatchings that had determined the lineage of rulers stretching back 40,000 years. 17 eggs. 17 potential heirs to the greatest empire the world had ever known. And every single one of them was splitting open in perfect, terrifying synchronization, as though some invisible conductor had raised a claw and signaled the opening movement of a symphony that would reshape the fate of nations. Emperor Velthorix the Undying stood at the far end of the hatchery chamber, his obsidian-scaled form towering nearly 40 feet from the polished floor to the crown of jagged horns that arched from his skull like a cathedral's spires. He was ancient, so ancient that the edges of his scales had begun to flake into something resembling black glass, and his eyes, once the color of molten gold, had faded to the pale amber of a dying star. He had ruled for 11,000 years. He had watched civilizations rise and crumble to ash beneath his shadow. He had personally consumed 3 rival emperors during the War of Splintered Thrones, and the bones of those rivals still decorated the pillars of his audience chamber as a warning to anyone foolish enough to challenge his supremacy. And in 11,000 years, he had never once felt the particular chill that crawled down his spinal column now. Beside him, his first consort, Ignashara of the Crimson Flame, shifted her massive bulk with considerably less composure. Her scales were the deep red of arterial blood, and wisps of actual fire leaked from between her fangs as she breathed, not from any conscious effort but from sheer nervous agitation. Dragons did not sweat. Dragons did not tremble. But Ignashara's tail was twitching against the stone floor, in a way that would have been embarrassing if anyone had been foolish enough to comment on it. 17, she whispered, the word escaping as a low hiss of superheated air. All at once, Velthorix, this does not align with the prophecies of the first shell. The prophecies are meaningless, Velthorix replied, though his voice carried none of its usual thunder. Instead, it was the quiet growl of a predator who had just realized that something in the darkness was watching back. They were written by priests who have never seen a hatching, translated through 6 extinct languages, and interpreted by scholars who wouldn't know a dragon's intent if it bit them on the snout. And yet 17 eggs have never hatched simultaneously, not once, in 40,000 years. Velthorix said nothing. He watched. The hatchery chamber itself was a masterpiece of architectural impossibility. Carved from the living heart of Mount Drakkar, the largest peak in the spine of the world, the chamber stretched upward for nearly 500 feet, its ceiling lost in a perpetual haze of heat and mineral-laden mist. The walls were covered in bas-relief carvings depicting every succession hatching in imperial history, each scene rendered in gold leaf and precious gemstones by artisans whose lineages had spent generations perfecting a single panel. The floor was black marble, polished to such a mirror sheen that the dragons reflected, and it appeared to be standing over a bottomless void. And in the center of it all, arranged in a precise geometric pattern that had been calculated by the Empire's foremost mathematicians and verified by 3 separate orders of seers, sat the 17 eggs. Each one was roughly the size of a warhorse, their shells a deep, iridescent black that shifted through colors like oil on water when the light hit them correctly, deep purples and greens and blues swirling across their surfaces in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost like writing in a language that no living creature could read. Veins of molten gold threaded through the shells, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic light that matched the heartbeat of something vast and ancient and impossibly powerful. They had been incubating for exactly 500 years, the proper time, the sacred time, and now, in a single breathtaking moment, they were all choosing to emerge together. The first shell cracked with a sound like a thunderclap. A fragment of black shell the size of a shield spun through the air and shattered against the marble floor, sending up a spray of golden sparks. Then another crack and another, and another. Within seconds, the chamber was filled with the sound, a cacophony of splitting shells and falling fragments, a percussive symphony that echoed off the walls and spiraled up into the mist-shrouded ceiling until the entire mountain seemed to be groaning in sympathy. Velthorix felt the presence of his court behind him. The imperial advisors, 12 dragons of various ages and colors, each one a master of some particular domain of governance or warfare or arcane knowledge. The high priestess of the flame eternal, draped in vestments woven from the shed skins of dead emperors. The generals of the 5 wings, their battle-scarred hides bearing the marks of 100 campaigns. The keeper of the hatchery himself, An ancient dragon named Threxir, whose sole purpose for the past 6 centuries had been the care and monitoring of these 17 eggs, whose entire existence had led to this single moment. All of them were silent, all of them were watching. The shells fell away completely, and for a moment, just a moment, the chamber was still. Then the hatchlings emerged. They were small, impossibly small given what they would become. Each one was roughly the size of a large dog, their scales still damp and soft, their eyes squeezed shut against the light of the chamber. They tumbled and staggered and rolled across the marble floor in a chaotic mass of limbs and tails and tiny, ineffective wings, making sounds that were not roars or growls or any of the fearsome noises that adult dragons produced, but rather something closer to the mewling of newborn kittens, high-pitched, desperate, and profoundly vulnerable. Ignatiara made a sound that Velthorix had never heard her make before. It was a soft, trembling exhalation, almost maternal, and it struck him suddenly that despite being his first consort, despite having lived for over 8,000 years, despite having burned entire armies to ash with a single breath, Ignatiara had never been a mother. None of his consorts had. The succession required that only the emperor's bloodline continue, and the rituals surrounding imperial reproduction were clinical, precise, and utterly devoid of anything resembling parental attachment. But looking at the tiny, mewling creatures stumbling over each other on the marble floor, Velthorix felt something shift inside his chest, something he had not felt in so long that he almost didn't recognize it. It was awe. Pure, simple, undiluted awe. The hatchlings were beautiful, not in the way that adult dragons were beautiful, all power and terror and majesty, but in a way that was entirely their own. Their scales were still translucent, letting the golden light of their internal fire show through like lanterns. Their wings were absurdly oversized for their bodies, folded awkwardly against their backs like collapsed parasols. Their tiny claws scrabbled against the marble as they tried to find their footing, and more than one of them simply gave up and lay on its back, waving all 4 legs in the air as though surrendering to the fundamental absurdity of existence. Look at them, Ignatiara breathed, and there were actual flames in her eyes now, not flames of anger but of something far more dangerous. Wonder. Look at them, Velthorix, 17 of them, 17 perfect. They are not perfect yet, Velthorix interrupted, though his voice lacked any real conviction. They must choose, that is the law, that has always been the law. The hatchlings choose their guardian, and through that guardian their path to the throne is determined. The first hatchling to choose commands the right of first succession, the others follow in the order of their choosing. I know the law, Ignatiara said sharply, but her eyes never left the hatchlings. The choosing was the most sacred ritual in the Dracorian Empire. It predated written history, predated the Empire itself, predated even the dragons' earliest myths about their own origins. When imperial hatchlings emerged from their shells, they did not immediately bond with their biological parents. They couldn't. Dragon hatchlings possessed no instinct for filial attachment. Such things were earned, not given. Instead, within the first hour of their lives, each hatchling would choose a guardian. This guardian could be any creature in the Empire, dragon, lesser beast, or even in rare and historically problematic cases, something else entirely. The guardian would raise the hatchling, shape its character, instill its values. And when the hatchling eventually came of age, usually around 500 years after hatching, it would be the guardian who presented the young dragon to the imperial court as a candidate for the throne. The bond between hatchling and guardian was absolute, unbreakable by any force short of death. A hatchling that chose poorly was doomed to become a poor ruler. A hatchling that chose wisely was destined for greatness. And the first hatchling to choose, the one that selected its guardian before any of its siblings, that hatchling held the right of first succession. It would be the primary heir to the throne. The others would be its rivals, its backup plans, its potential assassins. Everything depended on the choosing. That was why the chamber was so crowded. That was why every powerful dragon in the Empire had insisted on being present. They could not influence the choosing directly. The hatchlings' selections were instinctual, irresistible, and completely immune to coercion, magic, or bribery, but they could position themselves to be chosen. They could stand close to the hatchlings. They could project an aura of strength, of wisdom, of power. They could. Velthorix stopped mid-thought, because he had just noticed something that none of the others had noticed yet. Something that made the chill in his spine spread outward through his entire body like frost across a window. The hatchlings were not looking at the dragons. Every single one of the 17 tiny, mewling, desperately vulnerable creatures had oriented themselves in the same direction. Their eyes, still barely open, still bleary and unfocused, were all pointed toward the same spot in the chamber, not toward Velthorix, not toward Ignatiara, not toward any of the assembled might of the Dracorian Empire. They were looking at the far corner of the hatchery chamber. At the humans. His name was Kale Duskwalker, and he was going to die. He knew this with the same quiet, absolute certainty that he knew his own name, his own age, his own number of fingers and toes. He was going to die, and it was probably going to happen in the next 15 minutes, and there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. He stood in the corner of the hatchery chamber, the very furthest corner possible from the eggs, from the Emperor, from the gathered might of the dragon court, pressed against the wall so tightly that the bas-relief carvings of ancient hatchings were digging into his shoulder blades through his thin linen shirt. He was not wearing armor. He was not carrying a weapon. He was, in fact, wearing the clothes he'd been given when he'd been pulled from the dungeons 3 hours ago. The standard gray tunic and trousers of a prisoner, thin and stained and smelling of mildew. He was 32 years old. He was 5 feet 9 inches tall. He weighed at most 140 pounds, which was on the lean side even for a human who'd spent the last 8 months in a dungeon subsisting on moldy bread and questionable water. He had brown hair, brown eyes, a narrow face that one of his cellmates had once described as the kind of face that makes you look the other way, and a scar on his left forearm from a knife fight in a market square 7 years ago that he'd started and very much not finished. He was, by every possible metric, the most insignificant creature in a chamber filled with the most significant creatures on the planet. And he had no idea why he was here. 3 hours ago, 2 dragon guards, one green, one blue, both roughly the size of city buses, had appeared at his cell door. They'd opened it, which was unusual because the door hadn't been opened since he'd been thrown in 8 months ago. They'd looked at him, which was unusual because dragon guards had looked through him for the entirety of his imprisonment, treating him with the same indifferent disregard that a human might show to a particularly uninteresting cobweb. And then the green one had said, in a voice like boulders grinding together, "Come with us." That was it, no explanation, no justification, no opportunity to ask questions because Kale had learned very quickly that dragons did not appreciate questions from humans. He'd learned this on his first day in the capital, when he'd made the mistake of asking a dragon merchant for directions, and had received a response that singed off his eyebrows and left him with a healthy respect for the boundaries of draconic patience. So he'd gone with them. He'd walked through corridors of black stone that were larger than the streets of his hometown, past chambers that contained things he couldn't identify and didn't want to, up staircases that had been carved for legs much longer than his, and into a room where a very old dragon wearing what appeared to be ceremonial robes had looked him over with the expression of someone examining a particularly disappointing insect. Then they'd cleaned him up, roughly. A bucket of cold water, a coarse cloth, and a fresh set of the same gray clothes he'd been wearing, only with less mildew. They'd scrubbed the worst of the dungeon grime from his skin and hair, and the old dragon had inspected him again and apparently found him marginally less disappointing because he'd nodded once, a gesture that made the air vibrate, and said, "You will stand in the hatchery chamber. You will not speak. You will not move. You will not make any sound. If you do, you will be eaten, not as a punishment, as a consequence, do you understand?" Kale had understood. He hadn't understood why, but he'd understood the parameters of his survival, and in his experience, 32 years of being human in a world ruled by dragons, understanding the parameters of your survival was the single most valuable skill you could possess. So he stood in the corner, he didn't speak, he didn't move, he didn't make any sound. He watched the eggs hatch and he watched the tiny dragons emerge, and he felt something that he couldn't quite name, a stirring in his chest that was not fear, not exactly, though fear was certainly present. It was something else, something that had been buried so deep inside him that he'd almost forgotten it existed. It was the same feeling he'd had when he'd found the wounded bird in his mother's garden when he was 6 years old. The same feeling he'd had when his younger sister had cried herself to sleep after their father's beating, and he'd held her hand through the wall that separated their beds. The same feeling he'd had every time he'd seen something small and vulnerable and alone in a world that was designed to crush it. It was the urge to help. And it was, he knew with perfect clarity, the single most inappropriate urge he could possibly have in this particular situation. The hatchlings were stabilizing now. They'd found their feet, or most of them had. 2 in the back were still wrestling with the basic concept of gravity, and they were beginning to move. Not with purpose, not yet, but with the blind, instinctual urgency of newborns seeking something they couldn't name. The assembled dragons shifted. Velthoric straightened to his full height, his ancient scales catching the light and throwing it back in 1,000 fragmented rainbows. Ignashara lowered her massive head, her breath coming in slow, deliberate pulses that heated the air around her to a shimmer. The generals flexed their claws. The advisors adjusted their postures. Even the high priestess leaned forward, her vestments clinking softly with the sound of ancient scales. They were presenting themselves. Kale realized this with a dim, detached sort of clarity. They were making themselves available, visible, appealing to the hatchling's instincts. Everything they were doing, the posture, the breathing, the subtle shifts of scale and muscle, was designed to say the same thing: I am strong, I am worthy, choose me. It was, Kale thought, the dragon equivalent of a job interview. A job interview conducted by 17 newborn puppies who couldn't even open their eyes properly. And then one of the hatchlings broke away from the group. It was smaller than the others, noticeably, almost alarmingly smaller. Its scales were a pale, almost white silver, and its wings were so disproportionately large that it kept tripping over the trailing membranes. It moved with none of the purposeful urgency of its siblings. Instead, it wandered stumbling in a loose, wobbly spiral that took it further and further from the center of the chamber, away from the imposing forms of the dragons, away from the heat and the light and the power. Away from everything that made sense. Toward the corner. Toward Kale. The chamber went silent, not quiet silent. The kind of silence that has weight and texture that presses against your eardrums like deep water. Every dragon in the room stopped breathing, stopped moving, stopped existing as far as any external indication was concerned. They became statues, magnificent, terrifying statues carved from scale and muscle and ancient power, frozen in the act of being exactly what they were. Kale could feel their attention like a physical force. It was not focused on the hatchling, it was focused on him, on the human in the corner, on the insignificant, powerless, expendable creature toward whom a potential heir to the Dracorian Empire was currently stumbling with the determination of a drunk moth heading toward a candle. He wanted to run. Every instinct he possessed, every survival reflex honed by 32 years of being the weakest thing in any room he entered, screamed at him to run. To get away from the hatchling before it reached him, before the dragons could interpret his proximity as a threat, before the ancient and terrible mathematics of draconic justice calculated that the simplest solution to this problem was to incinerate everyone involved and start over with a new clutch of eggs. But he didn't run, not because he was brave. He wasn't brave, he'd never been brave, he'd spent his entire life being very practical about his cowardice, but because the old dragon had told him not to move. You will not move, you will not make any sound, if you do you will be eaten. And Kale Duskwalker had always been very good at following the rules that kept him alive. The hatchling reached him. It stopped at his feet, tiny, trembling, absurdly small against the vast expanse of black marble, and looked up at him with eyes that were barely open, clouded with the moisture of recent birth, and a color that Kale had never seen before. Not gold like a dragon's eyes should be. Not red or blue or green or any of the colors that marked the great draconic bloodlines. They were violet, a deep, vivid, almost luminous violet that seemed to glow from within, like starlight trapped in glass. The hatchling made a sound. A tiny, questioning sound, soft and uncertain and heartbreakingly vulnerable. It was the sound of something that had just entered the world and found it impossibly large and impossibly cold and impossibly lonely, and was asking in the only way it could if there was anyone who might make it feel less alone. Kale looked down at the hatchling. The hatchling looked up at Kale. And something passed between them, something that Kale could not have articulated if he'd had 1,000 years and a library of words. It was not a thought, it was not an emotion. It was something deeper than both, a recognition, a resonance, a meeting of two things that had no business being in the same room and yet, for reasons that defied explanation, fit together with the precision of a key sliding into a lock. The hatchling pressed its nose against Kale's ankle. And Kale felt the bond form. It was like being struck by lightning, except the lightning was warm instead of hot, and instead of destroying everything it touched, it built something. A connection, a thread of pure iridescent energy that linked his mind to the hatchling's mind, his heart to its heart, his existence to its existence. He could feel the hatchling's emotions as though they were his own. The confusion, the fear, the overwhelming newness of sensation, but beneath all of that, a foundation of something solid and unshakable. Trust. Absolute, instinctive, unreasoning trust. The hatchling had chosen him. The silence in the chamber shattered. No. The word was not spoken. It was detonated. Velthorix's voice hit the air like a physical weapon, a shockwave of sound and force that cracked the marble floor in radiating lines from his feet and sent the mist overhead swirling in violent spirals. The bas-relief carvings on the walls rattled. Gemstones popped free of their settings and tinkled to the floor. Two of the younger advisors staggered backward, their wings flaring involuntarily. But the word was not directed at Kale. It was directed at the hatchling. The tiny silver creature flinched at the sound. It couldn't help it, any more than a human baby could help flinching at a thunderclap, and pressed itself more tightly against Kale's ankle. Kale felt its fear spike through the bond, a sharp, needle-like jab of terror, and something inside him responded to it with a ferocity that surprised him. He didn't move, he didn't speak, but he shifted his weight just barely, just enough so that his body was angled between the hatchling and the Emperor. It was a gesture so small, so subtle that it might have been invisible, but it was a shield nonetheless. The only shield a human could offer against a dragon. Velthorix's eyes, the pale amber of a dying star, locked onto Kale with an intensity that made the air between them practically solidify. For a moment, the Emperor's ancient face held an expression that Kale couldn't read, because dragons did not express emotion the way humans did, and he'd spent his entire life being very careful not to look at dragon faces long enough to try. Then the expression resolved itself into something he could read, after all. Disgust. This is not possible, Vilthorix said, and this time his voice was controlled, quiet, measured, and infinitely more terrifying for its restraint. The bond has not formed correctly. The hatchling is impaired. It is confused by the unnatural presence of a human in the sacred chamber. This will be corrected. He took a step forward. Just one step, but the ground trembled beneath the weight of it, and the heat radiating from his body increased to the point where Kale could feel it on his face like the opening of a furnace door. The High Priestess spoke. Her voice was thin and reedy, the voice of a creature who had spent centuries in meditation and prayer until her body had become little more than a vessel for ritual. The Emperor speaks truth. The sacred texts are clear. No Imperial hatchling has ever chosen a guardian outside of draconic kind. The bond between hatchling and human is forbidden by the third decree of the first Emperor. The choosing must be voided. The hatchling must be. No. This time the word came from Ignatiara, and it stopped the High Priestess mid-sentence with the efficiency of a blade across the throat. The first consort's crimson head swung toward the priestess, and the fire leaking from her fangs intensified to the point where actual flames licked along the edges of her jaw. The bond cannot be voided, Ignatiara said, and her voice shook not with fear but with something that sounded almost like grief. You know this, priestess. You have studied the rituals for longer than this empire has had an emperor. The bond is absolute. It is inviolable. It cannot be broken by any force short of death. If you kill the hatchling. She stopped. The implication hung in the air like smoke. If you kill the hatchling, she continued more quietly, you kill a potential heir. In the hatchery chamber, during the choosing, the consequences of such an act would be incalculable. The consequences of allowing a human to raise an imperial hatchling are equally incalculable, the High Priestess shot back, her thin frame trembling with outrage. The third decree exists for a reason. Humans are inferior creatures, fragile, short-lived, emotionally unstable. They cannot provide the discipline, the power, the wisdom that an imperial dragon requires. A hatchling raised by a human would be. Would be what? Ignatiara's voice dropped to a dangerous purr. Say it, priestess, what would it be? The priestess's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. What came out was not what she'd been about to say. Weak, she whispered, it would be weak. The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Kale stood very still. The hatchling was pressed against his leg, trembling, its tiny claws hooked into the fabric of his trousers with a grip that was surprisingly strong for something so small. Through the bond, he could feel its emotional state with painful clarity. It was terrified of the loud noises, confused by the conflicting energies filling the room, and anchored only by the single point of warmth and safety that it had found in an otherwise incomprehensible world. That point was him. Kale Duskwalker, prisoner, thief. The man who'd been caught stealing a loaf of bread from a dragon merchant's supply wagon and sentenced to 8 months in a dungeon because the dragon merchant had felt disrespected by his existence. This was the creature that an imperial hatchling, potential heir to the greatest empire in the world, had chosen as its guardian. And every dragon in the chamber wanted him dead. He was going to die. He was absolutely, definitely, 100% going to. The second hatchling moved. Then the third. Then the fourth. Kale's breath caught in his throat as, one by one, the remaining 16 hatchlings disentangled themselves from their chaotic pile in the center of the chamber and began to move. Not toward the dragons, not toward the Emperor, not toward any of the magnificent, powerful, ancient beings who had spent millennia preparing for this moment. Toward him. They moved differently from the first hatchling. The silver one had wandered, almost accidentally, in Kale's direction. These moved with purpose, stumbling, awkward, deeply uncoordinated purpose, but purpose nonetheless. They fanned out across the marble floor in a loose, wobbly formation, their oversized wings dragging behind them, their tiny claws scrabbling for purchase on the smooth stone, and they converged on Kale's corner with the inexorable determination of a very small, very clumsy tide. The sixth hatchling, a deep emerald green, slightly larger than the others, reached him and butted its head against his other ankle. The bond formed again, a second thread of light connecting his mind to another consciousness, and Kale gasped at the sensation, 2 hearts beating alongside his own, 2 sets of emotions overlaying his thoughts, 2 tiny flames of awareness burning in the darkness of his mind. The ninth hatchling, a sturdy, dark-scaled creature with markings that reminded him of storm clouds, climbed onto his foot. The bond formed a third time, and Kale's legs nearly buckled at the intensity of it. The 11th, the 13th, the 15th. Each one that reached him added another thread, Another flame, another tiny, desperate, trusting consciousness to the growing constellation inside his mind. They piled against his legs, climbing, pressing, burrowing into the folds of his trousers as though trying to merge with him physically as well as mentally. The silver one, the first, the smallest, had somehow worked its way up to his knee and was perched there with its wings half spread for balance, its violet eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that was almost unsettling. By the time the 17th hatchling, a runty, almost comically small creature with scales that were a patchy mix of brown and gold, reached him and pressed its nose against his toe, Kale was holding 17 bonds simultaneously. His mind was on fire not with pain but with sensation. 17 hearts, 17 sets of emotions. 17 tiny, blazing points of awareness, each one distinct, each one unique, each one absolutely certain that it had found exactly what it was looking for. The silence in the chamber was so complete that Kale could hear the blood rushing through his own ears. He looked up. Every dragon in the room was staring at him, not at the hatchlings. At him. Their eyes, gold and red and green and blue and every shade in between, were fixed on the human in the corner with expressions that ranged from disbelief to horror to something that Kale could only describe as existential crisis. Emperor Valthorix had not moved. His ancient, massive form stood frozen in the center of the chamber like a monument to a world that had just stopped making sense. His pale amber eyes were fixed on Kale, and for the first time in his 11,000 years of existence, the Emperor of the Dracorian Empire had no idea what to do. Ignashara broke the silence. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the perfect stillness of the chamber, it carried like a bell. All of them, she said, all 17, they all chose him. No one responded. No one had a response. The laws of the Dracorian Empire, laws that had governed the succession of emperors for 40,000 years, laws that had been crafted by beings of incomprehensible wisdom and power, laws that were considered as immutable as the laws of physics, had no provision for this. No clause, no precedent, no footnote, no obscure commentary by a long-dead scholar that could be interpreted to apply to this situation. 17 imperial hatchlings had chosen a human guardian, all of them simultaneously, unanimously. The word unprecedented did not begin to cover it. Valthorix moved. It was not a step, it was not a gesture. It was a shift, a fundamental tectonic shift in the posture of a being who had not been uncertain about anything for so long that the sensation was almost unfamiliar. He turned his massive head toward the High Priestess, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet that Kale had to strain to hear it. "Is there any precedent," Valthorix said, "in any text, any record, any oral tradition, any source of any kind, for a single guardian being chosen by multiple hatchlings?" The High Priestess's face had gone the color of old parchment. Her hands, buried in the folds of her vestments, were shaking. "No, your immensity, there is no record of any guardian being chosen by more than one hatchling. The bond is exclusive, one hatchling, one guardian. It has always been thus. And yet it is happening now before us." Valthorix turned back to Kale. His eyes, those ancient, fatting, terrible eyes, traveled slowly downward from Kale's face to the hatchlings clustered around his legs, and something passed across his expression that Kale could not identify. It was not disgust, not anymore. It was not anger or hatred or any of the emotions that humans typically expected from dragons. It was curiosity. Pure, ancient, undiluted curiosity. The curiosity of a being that had seen everything and suddenly encountered something new. "Human," Valthorix said. Kale's heart stopped. Literally, for a full second, his heart stopped beating because the Emperor of the Dracorian Empire, the most powerful creature on the planet, a being who could reduce mountains to rubble and boil oceans to steam with a thought, had just spoken to him. Directly, personally, by designation rather than name, because dragons did not use human names, but still, he had spoken. The hatchlings felt Kale's fear spike through the bonds and responded instantly. The silver one on his knee chirped, a sharp, defiant sound that was almost comically brave for something so small, and pressed itself more tightly against him. The others shifted and squirmed, arranging themselves into a configuration that, Kale realized with a start, put as many of their tiny bodies between him and the Emperor as possible. They were protecting him. 17 newborn dragons, each one barely an hour old, were trying to protect a human from the Emperor of the Dracorian Empire. The absurdity of it was so overwhelming that Kale almost laughed. He didn't because laughing would have been a sound and sounds would get him eaten, but the laugh was there, bubbling up from somewhere deep inside him. A wild, hysterical, slightly unhinged laugh that said very clearly, the universe has completely lost its mind. "You will answer me, human," Valthorix said. "What is your name?" Kale hesitated. The old dragon, the one who'd prepared him for the chamber, had told him not to speak. But the Emperor was not the old dragon. The Emperor was the Emperor. And when the Emperor told you to do something, you did it, because the alternative was not being eaten as a consequence but being eaten as an example. Kale, he said, his voice sounded strange to him, rough and thin after 8 months of near silence in the dungeon. Kale Duskwalker. Duskwalker, Vilthorix repeated the name as though tasting it, rolling it around in his mouth like an unfamiliar piece of meat. A human name, meaningless, irrelevant, he paused. Tell me, Kale Duskwalker, what are you? The question was so unexpected, so fundamentally strange that Kale blinked. What was he? He was a human, that was obvious. That was the entire problem. He was a human in a chamber full of dragons, and the dragons wanted to know what he was, as though the answer might be something other than the most obvious thing in the world. I'm a human, Kale said. No, Vilthorix said, and the word carried a weight that made Kale's knees buckle. You are not. A human could not hold 17 bonds simultaneously. A human could not withstand the psychic pressure of 17 imperial hatchlings connecting to his mind at once. A human would have collapsed. A human would have died. You are standing. You are conscious. You are, his eyes narrowed, you are calm. Kale was not calm. Kale was the opposite of calm. Kale was a supernova of barely contained terror wrapped in a thin shell of prisoner's linen and held together entirely by the fact that 17 tiny dragons were currently using his legs as a nest. But through the bonds, he could feel something else, the hatchlings' trust, their absolute, unwavering, bone-deep certainty that they were safe, that they were where they were supposed to be, that the creature they had chosen, the small, warm, soft, fragile creature that smelled like mildew and fear and something underneath that was stubborn and fierce and kind, was exactly the right choice. And that trust feeding into his mind through 17 simultaneous channels was doing something to him. It was steadying him, not eliminating the fear but giving it a foundation, something to stand on, something to hold onto. The fear was still there, but it was no longer the only thing. Beneath it, around it, woven through it like threads of gold and black cloth, there was something else. Certainty. Not in himself. He had no certainty in himself. He was Kale Duskwalker, a thief and a failure and a man who'd spent his entire life being told that he was less than nothing. But certainty in them, in the hatchlings, in the bond. They had chosen him, all 17 of them, and the bond did not make mistakes. I don't know what I am, Kale said, and the honesty of it surprised him. I'm just a human. Vilthorix stared at him for a long time, a very long time, long enough that the silence became uncomfortable, then unbearable, then something beyond unbearable, a silence that had its own gravity, its own weight, its own suffocating pressure. Then the Emperor did something that no one in the chamber expected. He sat down. The Emperor of the Dracorian Empire, the Undying, the Unconquered, the Devourer of Rivals, the Lord of the Burning Throne, sat down on the floor of the hatchery chamber like a tired old man settling into a chair. His massive hindquarters hit the marble with a boom that sent cracks spiderwebbing outward, and his tail curled around his feet with a kind of deliberate patience that seemed utterly at odds with everything Kale had ever heard about draconic rulership. Silence, Vilthorix said, and the word was not directed at Kale. It was directed at everyone else. The generals of the Five Wings, who had been conferring in low, urgent growls, fell silent. The advisors who had been muttering among themselves in tones of barely contained panic shut their mouths. The High Priestess, who had been preparing what appeared to be a formal objection of some kind, swallowed whatever words she'd been about to say and folded her hands so tightly that her knuckles went white. Even Ignashara, who was perhaps the only dragon in the room who might have been able to challenge the Emperor's authority, closed her fangs and lowered her head in acknowledgement. Vilthorix looked at Kale, and Kale, standing in his corner with 17 hatchlings tangled around his legs and an emotion inside his chest that he couldn't name, looked back. In 11,000 years, Vilthorix said, and his voice had changed again, no longer the thunder of a ruler but something quieter, something almost contemplative. I have seen many things. I have seen stars die. I have seen mountains grow from nothing and crumble back to nothing. I have seen species arise and pass away like clouds across the sky. I have seen empires, dragon empires, human empires, empires of creatures that no longer exist, build themselves into monuments of greatness, and then collapse into dust because of a single flaw, a single weakness, a single failure of understanding. He paused, the hatchlings shifted against Kale's legs, their tiny claws pricking through the thin fabric of his trousers. I have also seen the choosing fail, Vilthorix continued. 3 times in my reign a hatchling has chosen poorly. Each time the result was the same, a weak emperor, a flawed ruler, a disaster for the empire. The last hatchling to choose poorly, his eyes dimmed as though with old pain, was my own sibling 4,000 years ago. He chose a guardian of great physical strength and minimal wisdom. He became an emperor of great physical strength and minimal wisdom. He burned 3 provinces to ash over a perceived insult and had to be put down by his own guard. The chamber was utterly still. This was history, secret history, the kind that was never written down, never spoken of, never acknowledged. The kind that only an 11,000-year-old emperor could know. The choosing is infallible, Vilthorix said. The bond cannot be wrong. This is not a matter of law or tradition or convenience. It is a matter of fundamental reality. The bond sees what we cannot see, it knows what we cannot know, it chooses what we would not choose. His eyes locked onto Kale's with an intensity that was almost physical. And the bond has chosen you, not one hatchling, all 17 simultaneously, unanimously. In 40,000 years of recorded history, this has never happened, not once, not approximately, not in a way that could be reinterpreted or explained away. This is unprecedented, this is impossible, and yet it is happening. He leaned forward, just slightly, just enough that the sheer scale of his head became even more apparent, his skull alone larger than Kale's entire body. So I will ask you again, Kale Duskwalker, not what are you? That question was foolish, and I am not a foolish dragon. I will ask you this instead, what do you feel? Kale's mouth went dry. The question was so unexpected, so fundamentally alien to the kind of question he'd been prepared for, threats, commands, perhaps a summary execution, that his mind went blank for a full 3 seconds. What did he feel? He felt the bonds, 17 threads of light connecting him to 17 tiny minds. He could feel their hunger, not physical hunger, not yet, but a deeper hunger, a hunger for knowledge, for experience, for understanding of the world they had just entered. He could feel their curiosity, the same kind of boundless, indiscriminate curiosity that drove human children to put everything in their mouths and pull everything off shelves and ask, why, until their parents wanted to scream. He could feel their trust, their absolute, heartbreakingly complete trust in the creature they had chosen. But beneath all of that, woven through all of it, there was something else. Something that he could only describe by analogy because he had no word for it. It was like standing in a river, not being swept away by it, not fighting against it, but standing in it, feeling the current flow around him and through him, feeling the power of it, the direction of it, the purpose of it. The bonds were not separate from him. They were part of him, extensions of his own consciousness, his own awareness, his own being. And through them he could feel not just the hatchlings, but something beyond the hatchlings, something vast, something ancient. Something that had been waiting with infinite patience for exactly this moment. I feel them, Kale said. His voice was rough, but it was steady. All of them, I feel what they feel, I feel what they need. And what do they need? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Kale looked down at the hatchlings. The silver one on his knee had fallen asleep, actually fallen asleep, its tiny head tucked into the crease of his knee, its breathing slow and steady. The emerald one was gnawing experimentally on his trouser leg. The storm cloud one was watching the other dragons with an expression that, on a human baby, Kale would have described as squinty skepticism. They need to be safe, Kale said. They need to learn, they need to grow. They need, he paused, searching for the right word, and found it in a place he hadn't known existed inside him. They need someone who won't hurt them. The words fell into the silence like a key turning in a lock. Velthorix closed his eyes. For a long, terrible moment, Kale thought the Emperor was preparing to destroy him. He could feel it, a buildup of energy, vast and ancient and barely contained, humming in the air like the charge before a lightning strike. The other dragons felt it too. Several of them backed away, their scales bristling, their wings half raised in instinctive self-preservation. But the lightning didn't strike. Instead, Velthorix opened his eyes and they were different. The pale amber had deepened, just slightly, just enough to suggest that something that had been fading was, for the first time in millennia, beginning to rekindle. Someone who won't hurt them, the Emperor repeated. He looked at his consorts, his generals, his advisors, his priestess. He looked at the assembled might of the Dracorian Empire, beings of immense power, incalculable age, and if he was being honest with himself, not inconsiderable cruelty. Beings who had been preparing for this moment their entire lives, positioning themselves to be chosen, scheming and maneuvering and calculating how best to mold a hatchling into a ruler that would serve their interests. Beings who, in 11,000 years of observation, had never once considered that the hatchlings might not want what they were offering. The bond is infallible, Vilthorix said quietly. The bond cannot be wrong, and the bond has chosen someone who will not hurt them. He looked at Kale. What will you do, human? If I let you walk out of this chamber with 17 imperial hatchlings clinging to your legs like barnacles on a ship's hull, what will you do? How will you raise them? What will you teach them? They are dragons, Kale Duskwalker. They will grow to be larger than buildings, more powerful than armies, more dangerous than anything your species has ever encountered. They will be capable of destroying nations with a single breath. And you, a human, a creature of flesh and bone and a lifespan that is to theirs what a mayfly's is to yours, will be responsible for shaping what they become. Kale swallowed. The question was fair. It was more than fair. It was the question that should have been asked before any of this had been allowed to happen, and the fact that it was being asked now by the Emperor himself was either a sign of extraordinary wisdom or extraordinary desperation. Probably both. I don't know, Kale said. And then, because honesty had got him this far and dishonesty would certainly get him killed, he added, I don't know how to raise a dragon. I don't know what dragons need to learn or how they learn or what kind of food they eat or how long they sleep or any of the things that a guardian should know. I'm a human. I've never even owned a pet. My mother died when I was 12 and my father was. He stopped. The hatchlings felt the spike of pain that came with the memory, his father's fists, his father's anger, his father's voice calling him worthless, and they responded instantly. The silver one woke from its sleep and pressed its face against Kale's hand. The emerald one stopped gnawing on his trouser leg and butted its head against his calf. One by one they all turned toward him, their tiny bodies pressing closer, their warmth seeping through the thin fabric into his skin. Comfort, they were offering him comfort. Kale's vision blurred. He blinked hard, forcing the moisture back from his eyes, because crying in front of the Emperor of the Dracorian Empire was probably a capital offense, and he'd already committed enough crimes to last several lifetimes. My father was not kind, he said, finishing the thought with a steadiness that surprised him. And I spent most of my life trying to be nothing like him. That's all I know, that's all I have to offer. I will not hurt them, I will not be cruel to them. I will not make them feel small or worthless or afraid. I don't know if that's enough. I don't know if anything I could offer would be enough for creatures like them, but it's what I have. He looked at Velthorix, and for the first time in his life he held a dragon's gaze without flinching. It's what I have, he repeated. The chamber was so quiet that Kale could hear the individual heartbeats of the hatchlings pressed against his legs. 17 tiny, rapid, impossibly precious rhythms that meant more to him in this moment than anything ever had. Velthorix was silent for a very long time. Then he stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and carried a weight of finality that made every dragon in the chamber stiffen to attention. He turned to face his court, his consorts, his generals, his advisors, his priestess, and when he spoke, his voice filled the chamber like a tide filling a cave. The choosing is complete, he said. The bonds have formed. The law is clear, the bond is inviolable. The hatchlings have chosen their guardian and their choice will be honored. Your Immensity, the High Priestess began. I have not finished. The priestess fell silent so abruptly that she nearly bit her own tongue. The bond is infallible, Velthorix continued. This is not a matter of opinion, it is not a matter of tradition, it is not a matter of convenience or preference or political expediency. It is a law of reality as fundamental as gravity, as immutable as time. The hatchlings have chosen. To reject their choice is to reject reality itself. He paused, letting the words settle. I will not reject reality. I am 11,000 years old. I have spent my entire life mastering reality, bending it, shaping it, breaking it, and remaking it according to my will, but I have never been foolish enough to deny it. Reality is, the bond is, the hatchlings have chosen a human and that human is their guardian. He turned to look at Kale one final time. His pale amber eyes, the eyes of a dying star, held something that Kale had never expected to see in a dragon's gaze. Respect, not much, not openly, just a flicker barely perceptible, there and gone like a fish surfacing in deep water. But it was there. Kale Duskwalker, Velthorix said, you are now the guardian of the 17. You will be given quarters in the Imperial Palace. You will be given access to the Imperial Archives, the Imperial Kitchens, and any resource within my power to provide. You will not be harmed, hindered, or interfered with by any creature in my empire on pain of death. This is my decree, and my decrees are not subject to appeal. He turned back to his court. As for the matter of succession, the law states that the first hatchling to choose holds the right of first succession. That hatchling is the silver one. The bond has confirmed it. When the hatchlings come of age, the silver one will be presented as the primary heir to the throne. Your Immensity, said one of the generals, a massive blue dragon with scars covering fully half his body. With respect, a dragon raised by a human will not be fit to rule. The other hatchlings perhaps as secondary heirs, but the primary heir must be. The primary heir, Velthorix said, and his voice dropped to a temperature that made the air crystallize, will be whoever the bond has determined it will be. You may of course challenge this determination. The ritual combat for succession is open to any dragon of imperial blood. The silver hatchling will be 500 years old at the time of the challenge. You are welcome to fight a 500-year-old dragon raised by a human if you believe that will end well for you. The general said nothing. I thought not, Velthorix said. He turned back to Kale, and something in his expression shifted, softened, almost, though soft, was a relative term when applied to a 40-foot dragon with obsidian scales and enough power to level a continent. Human, Kale Duskwalker, guardian of the 17. The Emperor's voice was quiet now, almost gentle, and the contrast with his earlier thunder was more unsettling than any volume could have been. You told me you would not hurt them, that you would not be cruel, that you would not make them feel small or worthless or afraid. These are good intentions, but intentions are wind, they shift, they change, they dissipate. He leaned down, bringing his massive head to a level with Kale's, and Kale could see every scale, every ridge, every ancient imperfection in the Emperor's face. He could see the gold flecks in those pale amber eyes, like the last embers of a fire that had been burning since before human civilization existed. Let me tell you something that no human has ever heard, Vilthorix said. Dragon hatchlings are not born powerful, they are born vulnerable, they are born small and soft and afraid, and they stay that way for a very long time. The first 100 years of a dragon's life are spent being protected by their guardian, by their bond, by the instinct that drives every adult dragon to defend the young. During those 100 years, the hatchling learns what the world is, what it means, how to exist in it. What to fear, what to trust. His eyes, those ancient, fatting, impossibly deep eyes, bored into Kale's. What they learn in those 100 years determines what they become. A hatchling raised in fear becomes a dragon of fear. A hatchling raised in cruelty becomes a dragon of cruelty. A hatchling raised in power without wisdom becomes a dragon of destruction. And a hatchling raised in kindness, he paused, and something flickered across his face that might have been memory, might have been regret, might have been something too old and too deep to have a name. A hatchling raised in kindness becomes something that this empire has not seen in a very, very long time. He straightened up. Do not fail them, Kale Duskwalker. Not because I will destroy you if you do, though I will, make no mistake, but because they deserve better than failure. They chose you, all 17 of them. They looked at you, a human, a creature of dust and brief life, and they saw something worth choosing. Do not prove them wrong. Kale stood in the corner of the hatchery chamber, surrounded by 17 sleeping dragon hatchlings, and felt the weight of an empire settle onto his shoulders like a cloak made of iron and starlight. He was still afraid. He was still Kale Duskwalker, a thief, a failure, a man with nothing to his name but a set of gray clothes and a scar on his arm. He was still human in a world that belonged to dragons, and nothing, no bond, no decree, no imperial favor, could change that fundamental truth. But the hatchlings were warm against his legs. Their hearts were beating. Their trust was absolute. And for the first time in his miserable, insignificant, breathtakingly brief life, Kale Duskwalker felt like he might actually be exactly where he was supposed to be. I won't fail them, he said. And the Emperor of the Dracorian Empire, ancient, terrible, undying, nodded once. In the corner of the chamber, 17 dragon hatchlings slept peacefully against the legs of a human, and the world, for the first time in 40,000 years, quietly and irrevocably changed. Kale Duskwalker would go on to raise all 17 hatchlings to adulthood. The silver one, named Ashara by Kale after his mother, would ascend to the burning throne 500 years later and reign for 3,000 years as Ashara the Gentle, the first emperor in Dracorian history to be described by historians not as terrible or magnificent or devastating, but as kind. Under her rule, the Dracorian Empire would enter its greatest age of peace, prosperity, and most scandalously to traditional historians, collaboration with the lesser races of the world. But that was a story for another time. This was the story of the choosing, and the choosing was complete.